Mr. Dawson stood by the front window, watching the quiet street outside his rental property. He felt a certain pride as he took in the house he'd owned for years, nestled in a neighborhood he believed was one of the finest around. He'd spent years carefully selecting his tenants, wanting only the right people who would fit into this part of town. To him, that meant families who respected the neighborhood's values, people who knew how to blend in. The day was calm until he noticed a car pulling up. His eyebrows furrowed as he saw a black family step out. A tall, well-dressed man, his wife, and two young children, excitedly looking at the house as they approached the door. Mr. Dawson watched them with a sense of unease creeping into his mind. He couldn't place why, but he felt something unsettling about them moving into his property, something that didn't sit right with his idea of the perfect tenant. Moments later, the knock echoed through the quiet house. Putting on his best polite smile, he opened the door to greet them, hiding the flicker of discomfort that flashed in his eyes. Elijah Johnson extended his hand warmly, introducing himself and his family. Elijah had a strong, friendly presence, and his wife, Mia, smiled as she held their son and daughter close, all of them exuding a hopeful energy that filled the doorway. Mr. Dawson forced a smile as they stepped inside, showing them through the living room, kitchen, and backyard. The Johnsons seemed genuinely interested. They asked thoughtful questions about the house, commented on the neighborhood, and mentioned how much they loved the area. But Mr. Dawson's smile became tighter with each passing minute. He responded with brief, almost forced answers, nodding in all the right places but struggling to shake the discomfort building within him. He found himself eyeing the family's every move, noticing details that he couldn't explain but felt mattered to him. He didn't know why, but he felt the urge to question them, to find any reason to keep them from renting here. When they reached the end of the tour, Elijah turned to him with a hopeful look, explaining how this home would be perfect for his family and how they were eager to settle in soon. Mr. Dawson felt the words ready on his tongue, the polite refusal, the excuse he'd thought of to let them down gently. But he hesitated, sensing the disappointment in their faces before he'd even spoken. He forced a sympathetic expression and mumbled that another family was interested in the property, and he didn't think the timing would work out. A flicker of understanding passed between Elijah and Mia. They nodded, their smiles fading slightly, though they stayed polite, thanking him for his time. Mr. Dawson watched as they walked back to their car, the hopeful energy drained from their faces. As he closed the door, he let out a breath, trying to reassure himself that he'd done the right thing. But as he turned back to the empty, silent house, he couldn't shake the image of the Johnsons' disappointed faces or the uncomfortable feelings settling in his gut. Later that evening, as Mr. Dawson sat alone in his quiet home, he felt a strange, lingering sense of unease. The Johnsons' visit replayed in his mind, but he quickly brushed it aside, reminding himself he'd made the right choice. After all, he thought, he was only looking out for the neighborhood. Yet the more he tried to convince himself, the harder it was to ignore a twinge of discomfort tugging at him. He couldn't pinpoint why, but something about the family's polite smiles and the father's friendly handshake left a mark on him, one that his usual justifications couldn't erase. The next morning, Mr. Dawson went about his day as usual, but a series of small frustrations began to creep in, almost as if the world was conspiring to unsettle him. First, he received an email from his property management company, notifying him that a long-term tenant in one of his other properties had decided to move out unexpectedly. This particular tenant had always paid on time, never caused trouble, and had been renting for years. The loss would hit his income hard, a blow he hadn't anticipated. Grumbling, he reached for his coffee mug, but it slipped from his hand and shattered on the kitchen floor, spilling coffee everywhere. Sighing, he bent down to pick up the broken pieces, his thoughts circling back to the empty rental property and the Johnsons' faces. As he cleaned up, he couldn't help but wonder why he was suddenly feeling so off balance. It wasn't just the tenant moving out, or the small annoyances. It was something deeper, a sense that maybe, just maybe, he'd made a mistake. That afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from his lawyer. Apparently, there was a minor issue with the title on another property he owned, one that could delay his ability to rent it out to new tenants until it was resolved. His frustration grew. One after another, things were slipping out of his control, leaving him feeling more trapped by his own decisions than ever before. In the following days, Mr. Dawson's frustrations seemed to build like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Each morning brought a new problem, and each one seemed to lead back to the properties he prided himself on managing so well. Bills started piling up from routine maintenance he'd put off for too long, and without new tenants moving in, his income was stretched thinner by the day. The empty house he'd shown to the Johnsons felt like a glaring reminder of his growing troubles. On a particularly gloomy afternoon, Mr. Dawson drove past the rental property. He slowed down as he approached, his eyes scanning the house almost out of habit. It stood there, neat and ready, yet strangely vacant, as though even the building itself was waiting for something. He thought back to the day he'd shown it to the Johnsons. The memory of their excited faces was now tinted with regret he hadn't anticipated, a feeling that seemed to stick no matter how many times he tried to brush it off. After lingering outside for a moment, he parked his car and walked up to the front door, taking a deep breath as he looked around. The quietness of the empty house seemed to echo louder than usual, filling him with a sense of unease. This place could have had a family in it by now, he thought, people laughing in the living room, children playing in the backyard. Instead, it was silent, the air thick with something he couldn't quite place, a strange combination of regret and isolation. As he moved through the rooms, he noticed small imperfections he hadn't seen before. A bit of peeling paint near a window, a loose floorboard by the kitchen sink. In his mind, he pictured the Johnsons fixing up these details themselves, making the space their own. The image made him pause, forcing him to confront a thought he'd been avoiding. Perhaps he'd turned away the wrong people. Maybe they would have been the kind of tenants who cared, who respected the home and brought life into it. Lost in thought, he barely noticed the vibration of his phone in his pocket. He fished it out, seeing a message from Susan, his neighbor and an old friend. She'd heard about his recent troubles and wanted to meet up for coffee to talk things over. Normally, he might have brushed it off, not wanting to discuss his problems with anyone. But tonight, the thought of company, of someone to share his burdens, even if only briefly, seemed oddly comforting. When they met later that evening, Susan greeted him warmly, her usual friendly smile, a welcome contrast to his troubled mind. They chatted briefly, catching up on neighborhood gossip and small talk, but eventually, Susan's expression turned more serious. "I heard about the tenants you turned away," she said gently, her tone devoid of judgment, but full of concern. "The Johnsons, right?" Mr. Dawson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yeah, nice enough folks, but I didn't think they'd really fit in here," he said, trying to sound casual, though he could hear the defensiveness in his own voice. Susan tilted her head, her gaze soft but steady. "Do you know much about them?" she asked. "I've met them a few times, actually. Elijah, he's a teacher, works with kids who've had a rough time in school. Mia volunteers at the local community center. They're really wonderful people, always willing to lend a hand. In fact, I thought they'd be a great addition to the neighborhood." Her words hit Mr. Dawson harder than he'd expected. He hadn't asked the Johnsons anything about their lives, their work, or their goals. He'd judged them based on his own assumptions, seeing only what he thought he knew and nothing of who they really were. An awkward silence lingered between them as he struggled to come up with a response, the weight of his own misjudgment pressing down on him. "I didn't know that," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The weight of Susan's words lingered long after they parted ways that night, and Mr. Dawson found himself tossing and turning, unable to shake the image of Elijah and Mia. He kept replaying the look in Elijah's eyes, the way he'd stood with quiet confidence despite the subtle dismissal he'd been shown. In the stillness of the night, Mr. Dawson felt a pang of guilt, a rare emotion he wasn't accustomed to. The thought crept into his mind that maybe he'd missed something important. blinded by a bias he had never fully acknowledged before. The following day, he tried to immerse himself in routine, answering emails, checking on other properties, handling the endless stream of paperwork that came with managing rentals. But every task felt hollow, and each time he looked at the empty applications on his desk, he felt an undeniable pull back to the Johnsons. An unexpected call snapped him out of his thoughts. It was another tenant, calling to inform him that they would be leaving due to the lack of recent updates to the property they rented. This was the third tenant to leave in less than a month, and Mr. Dawson could feel the stability of his once secure business beginning to crumble. His expenses were piling up, his income shrinking, and the pressure felt almost suffocating. He could sense a shift happening, something beyond his control that seemed almost like a consequence, one that he didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore. With a heavy heart, he found himself thinking back to Susan's words about Elijah's work as a teacher and Mia's volunteering. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how his preconceived notions had painted them in a way that had nothing to do with who they actually were. They had likely faced countless challenges, worked harder than most, and still chose to give back to the community. Mr. Dawson knew he'd shut the door on them, not just physically, but in a way that was deeper, and, in that realization, he began to understand the weight of his mistake. Determined to confront this growing sense of regret, he picked up his phone and looked up Elijah's number from the application. His hand hesitated over the screen, unsure if reaching out would even be welcome at this point. What would he say? How could he explain his actions without sounding hollow or insincere? He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and finally dialed the number. The phone ringing as he waited, his heart thumping harder than it had in a long time. The phone rang several times before it went to voicemail, and Mr. Dawson felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment. His pulse slowed, but his mind continued to race. Leaving a message felt pointless. What could he even say that would convey the regret he'd come to feel? He ended the call without leaving a message, his hand lingering over the phone for a moment longer, uncertain, before finally setting it down. But the feeling of unfinished business gnawed at him, so much so that it was impossible to ignore. He found himself driven by a restless need to make things right, as if somehow apologizing might ease the heavy discomfort that had settled over him. With a reluctant sigh, he gathered his things, deciding he would visit Elijah in person. After all, he thought, some things had to be handled face to face. Maybe it would bring closure, or at least a chance for him to make sense of the regret that had taken hold. A short drive later, he found himself parked outside the community center, where Susan had mentioned Mia volunteered. The building was modest but well-maintained, with a small garden out front and a steady flow of people coming and going. He felt a pang of unease as he took in the scene, realizing he was about to walk into a place where he'd be an outsider, possibly unwelcome. But he steadied himself, reminding himself that he was here for a reason. He wanted to set things right, and if that meant swallowing his pride, then so be it. As he walked into the building, a cheerful woman at the front desk greeted him, her warm smile catching him off guard. He asked if Mia was available, hoping she might remember him enough to grant him a few moments of her time. The receptionist kindly directed him down a hallway, mentioning that Mia was just wrapping up a session with a group of young children in a reading class. Mr. Dawson felt a mixture of nerves and apprehension as he followed the directions, wondering how this encounter would play out. He reached the doorway and peered inside, his gaze falling on Mia as she sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a small circle of children who listened intently as she read aloud from a picture book. Her voice was soft yet filled with energy, bringing each character in the story to life. The children seemed captivated, hanging on to every word with bright, eager expressions. Mr. Dawson felt a strange warmth in his chest as he watched her, realizing for the first time the quiet impact she had on those around her. Here was a woman who gave her time and energy freely, nurturing young minds, instilling in them a love for stories and learning. As she finished the story and the children clapped with delight, Mia looked up and noticed him standing in the doorway. Her expression shifted subtly, a flicker of surprise passing over her face as she recognized him. She rose gracefully, murmuring a few words to the children, who reluctantly scattered, allowing her to approach him with a polite but cautious smile. "Mr. Dawson," she greeted him, her voice calm but with a hint of curiosity. "I didn't expect to see you here." He cleared his throat, suddenly feeling awkward and out of place. I wanted to talk to you, if you have a moment." I know this might seem unusual, but I realized I made a mistake, a big one. Mia raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. She crossed her arms lightly, waiting for him to continue. The silence felt heavy, each second stretching as he struggled to find the right words. He knew he was here to apologize, but somehow, in her presence, the words he'd prepared seemed inadequate. "I wasn't fair to you and your family," he admitted finally, his voice soft, but filled with a sincerity he hadn't felt in a long time. "I made assumptions about things I didn't understand, and I realize now that I let those assumptions cloud my judgment. I'm sorry, truly. I know it may not mean much now, but I wanted you to hear it from me." Mia's expression softened, though she remained quiet, taking in his words. Mr. Dawson could feel his own heartbeat, each second stretching as he waited, unsure of what her response might be. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm but steady. "Thank you for saying that," she replied, her tone respectful yet firm. "But do you understand why it hurt us? It wasn't just about losing a rental. It was the feeling that no matter what we did, how hard we worked, or how much we wanted to belong, we would always be judged for something as simple as the color of our skin." Her words cut through him, laying bare the impact of his actions in a way he hadn't fully comprehended until now. For the first time, he saw the weight of his choices reflected in someone else's eyes, and it was humbling, almost painful. Mr. Dawson stood there, absorbing Mia's words, each one settling over him with a heaviness he hadn't expected. Her calm, measured tone made her message even more powerful, and he felt a knot of regret tightening in his chest. He realized now that his decision had been more than a simple refusal. It had been a dismissal of their dignity, of their right to be seen as more than just the assumptions he'd imposed on them. And here she was, standing before him, willing to give him the time to speak, even after he'd closed a door on her and her family. I hadn't thought of it like that," he admitted quietly, his voice thick with the shame he could no longer hide. "I've been set in my ways, I suppose, and I never questioned it. I thought I was just protecting what I knew, but it seems I was protecting an idea that wasn't fair or even right." He looked down, struggling to meet her gaze. "I can't undo what I did, but I want to make things right, if you'd allow me to." Mia watched him carefully, her expression softening just slightly. She seemed to be weighing his words, assessing whether this man before her was truly beginning to understand the impact of his actions, or if he was simply appeasing his own conscience. After a moment of silence, she spoke again, her tone a little warmer yet firm. "Mr. Dawson, I appreciate your apology," she said, choosing her words thoughtfully. "But you have to understand, it's not just about saying sorry. It's about how you choose to move forward from here. If you want to make things right, it's going to take more than just words." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words and recognizing the truth in them. This wasn't something he could fix with a simple apology. It required a change in how he saw the world, in how he acted and thought. "I understand," he said, his voice steady. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away or trust me again easily, but I want you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn that chance. If there's anything I can do, please, let me know." Mia's expression softened further, and there was a trace of compassion in her eyes, though she still held her guard. She glanced around at the children who were beginning to gather again, eager for her attention, before looking back at him. "There might be a way for you to start," she said finally, almost as though testing his sincerity. "We're hosting a community event here next week. It's a fundraiser for the center, and we're always looking for volunteers. You could come by, help out, and see firsthand what we're about, if you're open to that." Mr. Dawson felt a flicker of surprise at her suggestion. He hadn't anticipated her willingness to offer him a path forward, and yet here she was, giving him a chance to step out of his comfort zone and do something meaningful. He nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. "I'd be honored," he replied sincerely. "Thank you, Mia. I'll be here to help however I can." She gave him a small, approving nod before turning back to the children. As he made his way toward the exit, Mr. Dawson felt a sense of purpose and humility settling over him, knowing that this was just the beginning of his journey to make amends, not only with Mia and her family, but within himself. The days leading up to the community event weighed on Mr. Dawson in a way he hadn't anticipated. He felt a restless energy, a mix of nerves and determination, knowing this would be his first real step toward making things right. The thought of being surrounded by people who might see him as an outsider, or worse, as someone who had once looked down on them, made him uneasy. Yet he understood that this discomfort was part of the path he needed to take. It was time for him to face the consequences of his choices, to step out of the narrow world he'd built around himself. When the day of the event finally arrived, Mr. Dawson dressed in his best effort at casual clothes, feeling oddly self-conscious as he headed to the community center. The building was bustling with people, filled with lively conversation and laughter, children running around with excitement. He hesitated at the entrance, momentarily overwhelmed by the unfamiliar warmth of the place. For years, he'd isolated himself in the security of his properties, managing everything from a distance, and now he was stepping into a space that felt more like family than just a building. Mia spotted him from across the room and waved him over, her expression a mixture of encouragement and curiosity. She introduced him to a few of the volunteers, explaining his role for the day, setting up tables, helping with the decorations, and assisting in serving food to guests. It wasn't glamorous work, but Mr. Dawson felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, a strange satisfaction in contributing without expecting anything in return. As he worked, he noticed Elijah walking around, chatting easily with community members and other volunteers. The man radiated a quiet confidence, a warmth that people naturally gravitated toward. Watching him, Mr. Dawson felt a pang of regret once more, realizing how much he had misjudged him, how much he had missed by viewing him through such a narrow lens. He caught Elijah's eye, and after a brief moment of hesitation, walked over, wiping his hands on his shirt, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. "Good to see you here, Mr. Dawson," Elijah greeted him, his tone polite but guarded, as though he, too, was still assessing what kind of man this landlord truly was. "I didn't expect to see you working with us today," Mr. Dawson nodded, searching for the right words. I wanted to come. I realized I've been missing out on a lot. I thought this might be a way to start understanding things better, and maybe earn a bit of trust back." His words felt clumsy, but they were genuine, and he hoped Elijah could sense that. Elijah regarded him for a moment, then nodded with a faint smile. "We all have our learning moments," he replied. "What matters is what we do with them. Actions speak louder than words, right?" Mr. Dawson felt a weight lift, his shoulders relaxing at the subtle reassurance in Elijah's words. He wasn't being judged or shut out. Instead, he was being given a chance, something he hadn't expected but deeply appreciated. As the afternoon wore on, he found himself fully immersed in the event, serving meals, cleaning up tables, and even chatting with a few of the community members who came up to introduce themselves. By the end of the day, he felt an exhaustion that was different from anything he'd known. An exhaustion that came from honest work, from opening himself up to new people and perspectives. As the event wound down, Mia and Elijah approached him, their expressions warmer than before. "Thank you for coming today," Mia said, her tone sincere. "You didn't have to, but you chose to be here, and that says something." Mr. Dawson smiled, feeling a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. "I should be the one thanking you for letting me come. I didn't realize how much I needed this, how much I needed to see things differently. It's eye-opening." Elijah extended a hand, and Mr. Dawson took it, shaking it firmly, feeling the weight of that handshake, this time not as a transaction, but as a step towards something genuine. As he left the center, he felt a quiet resolve growing within him. This was only the beginning, but he was ready to keep going, to see where this path might lead. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Dawson found himself drawn back to the community center. Each visit, a little less daunting, a little more familiar. He volunteered for events, attended small gatherings, and even took part in a few of the reading sessions Mia led for the children. As he spent more time there, he began to see the community not as outsiders, but as neighbors. People with lives, stories, and aspirations just as complex and valid as his own. He grew to admire Mia and Elijah's commitment to the center. Elijah, with his easygoing manner, was a mentor to many of the kids, guiding them with patience and humor, while Mia's warmth and energy made her a natural with the children and other volunteers alike. Mr. Dawson watched them in awe, realizing how much they poured into this place, how it was more than just a building to them, it was a part of who they were. And gradually, he felt a shift within himself, a softening that allowed him to see beyond the rigid beliefs he'd clung to for so long. One day, as he helped set up for another event, he noticed a small group of people gathered around Elijah. They were laughing and chatting animatedly, and Mr. Dawson felt a pang of curiosity. When he approached, he caught snippets of the conversation and realized they were discussing a new program Elijah had been working on, a mentorship initiative for teenagers in the neighborhood who struggled with school or came from difficult backgrounds. Elijah was hoping to offer guidance and support, giving them a place where they could find encouragement and direction. As he listened, Mr. Dawson felt a twinge of something unexpected, a desire to contribute. This program, he realized, was something he could help with in a tangible way. He had properties that weren't currently in use, places that could serve as spaces for tutoring sessions or workshops. It was an idea that surprised him, even as it excited him. Later that day, after most people had left, Mr. Dawson approached Elijah, feeling a strange mix of apprehension and hope. "Elijah," he began, hesitating only a moment before continuing, "I heard about your mentorship program. It sounds like something that could really make a difference for a lot of kids." He paused, then gathered his courage to make his offer. I have a couple of spaces that aren't being used right now. If you think it could help, maybe we could use one as a tutoring or activity space. I'd be happy to donate it to the center." Elijah looked at him with surprise, a flicker of disbelief in his eyes. Mr. Dawson braced himself, unsure how his offer would be received. He knew it wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step, one that felt meaningful, even if it was small. After a moment, Elijah's expression softened, and he gave Mr. Dawson a nod, a warm smile breaking across his face. "That would be incredible, Mr. Dawson. You have no idea how much that would mean to the kids here, and to all of us. Thank you." A weight seemed to lift from Mr. Dawson's shoulders as he realized he'd finally taken a step that felt truly right. This wasn't just about an apology or a redemption. It was about making a real difference, about using what he had to support something he'd once looked down upon. For the first time in a long while, he felt a genuine sense of purpose, knowing that he was not only trying to undo a wrong, but to actively contribute to something greater than himself. As the days passed, the mentorship program began to take shape with surprising speed. The empty property Mr. Dawson had offered was transformed into a welcoming space, complete with comfortable seating, study areas, and a small library of donated books. Community members pitched in, bringing supplies and helping with the setup, each of them showing gratitude that humbled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Watching the place come alive, Mr. Dawson felt an unfamiliar sense of pride, not for the property, but for what it was becoming, a safe haven where young people could come, learn, and feel valued. On the opening day of the program, the room buzzed with excitement. Teenagers filed in, some with their parents, others with friends, all curious and hopeful about what the mentorship sessions might bring. Mr. Dawson hovered near the back, observing as Elijah moved easily among the crowd. welcoming each person with a handshake or a kind word. Mia was there too, her smile warm, as she handed out brochures and introduced herself to parents. The atmosphere was light, filled with laughter and anticipation, and Mr. Dawson found himself caught up in the energy of it all. At one point, Elijah spotted him in the back and walked over, his expression one of genuine gratitude. "I'm glad you're here," he said, his voice steady, yet filled with warmth. "This place wouldn't have been possible without your support, Mr. Dawson. You didn't just provide a space, you made it possible for these kids to feel they have somewhere they belong." Mr. Dawson nodded, feeling a surge of emotion he hadn't expected. "Please, call me Tom," he replied, offering a small smile. "And thank you, Elijah, for giving me a chance to be part of this." He looked around at the faces of the young people who now filled the room, each one representing a life he could positively impact. For the first time, he felt part of something real, something that extended beyond the walls of his properties and into the heart of the community he'd once kept at arm's length. As the session began, Elijah invited him to stay and observe, and Mr. Dawson took a seat, watching as the program kicked off. Elijah spoke to the group, encouraging them to share their dreams, their struggles, and the challenges they faced. The teenagers listened intently, their expressions open and trusting, and one by one they began to share their own stories. Some talked about difficulties in school, others about family hardships, each voice filled with a raw honesty that moved Mr. Dawson deeply. In that moment, he realized how limited his own life had been, how narrow his perspective had become over the years. He'd been so focused on maintaining his properties, his image, and his own world that he had shut out the richness of human connection. Watching these young people open up, he saw a resilience and hope that he hadn't known existed, and he felt a profound respect for the journey each of them was on. After the session ended, a few of the teenagers approached him, introducing themselves and thanking him for the space. Their gratitude was sincere, their smiles genuine, and Mr. Dawson felt a warmth he hadn't felt in years. A sense of belonging he had never thought he'd find here, among people he'd once overlooked. As he left that evening, he knew that his life had taken a turn he couldn't have foreseen, a turn that brought him closer to understanding what it truly meant to be part of a community. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone. He felt as though he'd found a place where he could give, where he could matter in ways that went beyond financial gain or property value. It was a quiet, deep fulfillment, one that filled the emptiness he hadn't even realized he'd carried all these years. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Dawson, or Tom as he was now known around the center, became a regular presence at the mentorship sessions. At first, he simply observed, watching as Elijah and Mia led discussions, encouraged the teens, and helped them with everything from schoolwork to personal challenges. But gradually, Tom found himself becoming more involved, offering advice on practical matters, sharing stories from his own life, and more than anything, listening. One afternoon, as the group wrapped up a session on goal setting, a teenage boy named Marcus approached Tom. Marcus was a bright, ambitious kid with a natural curiosity, but he often seemed distracted and a little withdrawn. Over time, Tom had noticed the young man's tendency to stay quiet, hanging back while others shared their thoughts. Tom smiled as Marcus approached, hoping this was an opportunity to connect. "Mr. Dawson." "Tom, Marcus started, shifting nervously on his feet. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, Marcus," Tom replied, motioning for him to sit down. "What's on your mind?" Marcus hesitated, looking down as he collected his thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about my future," he said slowly. "I want to be successful, but I don't really know where to start. Everyone talks about goals, but it feels like something only people with money can achieve, you know?" Tom felt a pang as he listened to Marcus. He recognized the uncertainty and doubt that so many young people faced, especially those who grew up feeling the odds were stacked against them. He'd never experienced those struggles himself, but he'd come to understand how different life looked when you weren't surrounded by resources and support. Taking a deep breath, he leaned forward, choosing his words carefully. "I used to think success was about money and security too, Marcus," he admitted. "For a long time, I only focused on protecting what I had. But I've come to realize that success isn't just about what you own. It's about what you give, what you build, and the people you help along the way." He paused, watching as Marcus absorbed his words. "Your dreams are just as valid as anyone else's, and you don't need money to start building them. What you need is determination, patience, and the courage to keep going, even when things get hard." Marcus looked up, his eyes shining with a glimmer of hope. "Do you really think I could make something of myself?" he asked softly, almost as if he didn't dare believe it. Tom smiled, nodding with conviction. "I know you can, Marcus. You've got a good head on your shoulders and a kind heart. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, tell you otherwise." As they sat there, sharing an unspoken understanding, Tom felt a deep sense of connection with Marcus, a feeling he hadn't known he was missing. This was what he'd been searching for all along, not wealth, not reputation, but the chance to leave a real impact on someone's life, to be a part of something that extended beyond himself. From that day on, Tom took on a more active role in the mentorship program, spending time with each young person who sought his advice, offering his experiences and guiding them in ways he hadn't thought possible. He'd found a purpose he'd never known he needed, and with each passing day, he felt himself becoming a better man, a man he hoped his community would be proud to call one of their own. As the mentorship program flourished, Tom found himself transforming in ways he never imagined. He'd gone from being a solitary landlord, disconnected from the lives of those around him, to someone who truly understood what it meant to be part of a community. His life, once defined by financial gain and isolation, was now filled with purpose and connection. Each visit to the community center gave him a renewed sense of belonging, and the relationships he formed began to fill the void he hadn't even realized existed. One evening, after a particularly engaging session with the teens, Tom stayed behind to help clean up. Mia and Elijah were there as well, stacking chairs and tidying the room. As they worked, they began talking, reflecting on how much the program had grown and how many young lives they'd been able to touch. Mia looked at Tom with a gentle smile, her eyes warm with gratitude. "You've become a real part of this, Tom," she said softly, her voice carrying an unmistakable sincerity. "It's hard to believe how much things have changed since the day we first met you." Tom felt a mix of humility and pride, realizing just how far he'd come since that fateful day. "I never thought I'd find myself here, helping out, getting to know all of you," he admitted, glancing around the room that had come to mean so much to him. "Honestly, I was set in my ways, too stubborn to see what I was missing." Elijah joined them, nodding in agreement. "Sometimes all it takes is a little nudge to open your eyes," he said, clapping a hand on Tom's shoulder. "And you've not only opened yours but given others the courage to open theirs too." As they finished cleaning, a few of the teenagers approached them, lingering near the doorway. Marcus, who had grown particularly close to Tom, spoke up, his tone shy but sincere. "Hey, Mr. Dawson." Tom," he said, scratching his head. "A few of us wanted to say thank you for everything. We wouldn't have this space or these opportunities without you." Tom felt a lump in his throat as he looked at Marcus and the other teens. Each of them carried a spark, a potential that he now realized he could help nurture. He reached out, patting Marcus on the shoulder. "Thank you, Marcus. You and everyone here have given me as much as I could ever give you. Being here, seeing all of you grow, it's changed me, more than I can say." As they all shared a quiet moment, the weight of what they'd built together settled over Tom like a warm, comforting blanket. This wasn't just a program or a project, it was a community, a family built on trust, kindness, and shared dreams. And Tom, who once stood at a distance, was now woven into the very fabric of it all. As the night drew to a close, he locked up the center alongside Mia and Elijah, feeling a deep sense of contentment and purpose. For the first time, He wasn't just someone passing through life alone. He was part of something lasting, something that would continue to grow and thrive long after he was gone. And that, he realized, was the truest form of success. The days turned into weeks, and Tom found himself not only more deeply integrated into the community, but also transforming in ways he never expected. His old habits, his rigid ways, and his prejudices had all begun to dissolve, replaced by a genuine compassion and openness that surprised even him. He looked forward to every session at the community center, eager to see the familiar faces of the teenagers he'd come to care for so deeply, and grateful to work alongside Mia and Elijah, who had become dear friends. One Friday afternoon, Tom received a letter that shook him. It was from a former tenant of his, one he hadn't heard from in years. The letter was straightforward yet filled with raw honesty. The tenant described how they had once felt judged, as though they were never good enough to truly belong in one of his properties. They explained how they'd moved out not only because of rising rents, but because they'd never felt welcome or valued as a person. It was a hard letter for Tom to read, each sentence a painful reminder of the man he used to be. He sat with the letter for a long time, absorbing the depth of the hurt he had caused, not only to that tenant, but likely to many others over the years. He felt a pang of remorse, realizing that his past actions had left ripples, impacting lives in ways he hadn't considered, but as he sat there, he also felt a quiet resolve grow within him. He couldn't change the past, but he could do something now to make things right. He decided he would reach out to his past tenants, offer them his apologies, and make amends wherever he could. Over the following weeks, he began reaching out to each former tenant individually, expressing his regret and offering not just apologies, but actions to show his commitment to change. He reviewed the rent structures on his properties, setting aside several units for lower-income families who needed safe and stable housing. He worked with local organizations to provide affordable housing, dedicating a portion of his properties to families facing financial hardships. As word spread of Tom's transformation and efforts, he started receiving unexpected support. The community came together, offering their help with renovations, donations for essential household items, and time to assist the new families settling into his properties. Tom was overwhelmed by the generosity and kindness that surrounded him, the very same generosity he had once overlooked. Now, he was a part of it, contributing to a shared mission of uplifting those who had once been invisible to him. One evening, as Tom attended a small gathering held at the community center to celebrate the new housing initiative, he stood at the front of the room, nervous yet grateful. Mia and Elijah introduced him, and the room fell silent as he took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Thank you," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "Thank you for welcoming me into this community, even when I didn't deserve it. You all taught me something I never thought I needed to learn, that the real value of life isn't in what we own or control, but in the connections we build and the lives we touch." He paused, looking around at the familiar faces, many of whom he now counted as friends. "I can't undo my mistakes, but I can promise that I'll continue to do better, for each of you, and for those who come after. You've shown me a new path, one I never saw for myself, and I'll walk it with you for as long as I can." As he finished, the room erupted into applause, and Tom felt a deep, abiding sense of peace. For the first time, he felt truly at home, not just in the community, but in himself. The applause faded, replaced by the warmth of hands shaking his, pats on his back, and the quiet, heartfelt gratitude from those who had once been strangers but were now his family. And as he looked around, he knew that this was what he'd been searching for all along: a purpose, a community, and the joy of a life shared with others. As the weeks went by, Tom's journey continued to unfold in ways that deepened his understanding and commitment. The mentorship program at the community center thrived, thanks to the support and encouragement from Tom and the many others who now saw its value. Word of his transformation had spread throughout the town, and more people had begun to reach out to him, inspired by his efforts to make amends and build something meaningful for those who had once felt overlooked. One Saturday, during a quiet moment at the center, Mia approached him with a warm smile, carrying a small envelope in her hand. She handed it to him with a twinkle of excitement in her eyes. "This is from the town council," she explained, watching his reaction. "They've been following the work you've been doing here, and they wanted to recognize you for it." Tom opened the envelope carefully, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a formal letter of appreciation from the town council, thanking him for his contributions to the community and his dedication to creating affordable housing for local families. It went on to mention an upcoming ceremony in his honor, where he would receive a Community Leadership Award, a gesture that nearly brought tears to his eyes. He looked up at Mia, humbled and a bit overwhelmed. "I don't know if I deserve this," he said, his voice soft. "I was just trying to make things right." Mia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've done more than that, Tom. You've shown all of us the power of change and forgiveness. You've reminded us that people can grow and become better, no matter their past." Her words were filled with a sincerity that touched him deeply. On the night of the ceremony, Tom stood before a gathering of community members, friends, and family at the town hall, his heart filled with gratitude and disbelief. He looked out over the crowd and saw familiar faces: Elijah, Mia, Marcus, and so many others who had become a part of his life in ways he never could have imagined. The applause echoed through the hall as he approached the podium, and for a moment, he simply stood there, taking it all in. When he spoke, his voice was steady, filled with a quiet strength born from the journey he had undertaken. "Thank you," he began, looking out at the faces of those who had supported him, challenged him, and helped him grow. "I never imagined I'd be here, standing before all of you, receiving an honor like this. I spent most of my life closed off, focused only on my own interests, unable to see the world outside my own perspective." He paused, gathering his thoughts as he continued. "But through all of you, I've learned that life is about so much more. It's about opening our hearts, lifting each other up, and finding purpose in giving rather than taking. You've shown me that true wealth isn't measured by what we own, but by the lives we touch." As he spoke, he saw smiles and nods throughout the crowd, his words resonating with those who knew the journey he had taken to get here. To anyone who feels like they can't change, or that their past defines them, I hope you know that it's never too late to grow, to seek forgiveness, and to make things right. This community has given me a second chance, and I intend to honor that every day. The applause that followed was filled with warmth and pride, a sound that wrapped around him like a comforting embrace. As he stepped down, Elijah and Mia were there to greet him, their faces beaming with pride. Marcus approached as well, grinning as he shook Tom's hand, his eyes filled with admiration. That night Tom left the town hall feeling lighter than he ever had before. He walked through the quiet streets, reflecting on how far he'd come, the friendships he'd gained, and the lives he had touched. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by a community he loved, and finally at peace with himself. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, Tom's life settled into a rhythm that felt more fulfilling than anything he'd ever known. Each day brought new opportunities to contribute, to connect, and to keep learning from the community that had opened its doors to him. He continued his work with the mentorship program, spending time with the teenagers who looked up to him, sharing life lessons he'd learned through his own journey, and listening to their dreams and fears with genuine interest and compassion. One late afternoon, as he was packing up after a session, he saw Marcus lingering near the doorway, looking as though he wanted to say something. Tom walked over, giving him an encouraging nod. "Everything all right, Marcus?" Marcus shifted, glancing down before looking back up with a determined expression. "I just wanted to tell you, you've been a huge inspiration to me, Mr. Dawson." "I mean, Tom," he corrected, his cheeks flushing slightly. "Watching you change and become, well, who you are now, it's shown me that I don't have to be limited by where I come from, or by the mistakes I make along the way." Tom felt a surge of pride and warmth as he listened, realizing that his journey was now helping others find their own paths. "Marcus, that means the world to me," he replied, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Remember, change isn't about who we were, but about who we choose to become, and I know you've got everything it takes to make a difference, both for yourself and for others." The young man nodded, a determined glint in his eyes. "Thanks, Tom. I won't forget that." With that, he gave a small wave and headed out, leaving Tom with a sense of purpose and fulfillment that settled warmly in his chest. As the sun began to set, Tom took a moment to step outside the community center, looking out over the neighborhood he'd come to call home. The streets, the buildings, the people. They were no longer just parts of a place he managed. They were part of a life he shared. And standing there, he realized that his transformation hadn't just been about correcting past mistakes or seeking forgiveness. It had been about finding the courage to embrace a new way of living, one that valued compassion, connection, and growth. In that quiet moment, Tom Dawson knew he had finally found peace, not in what he possessed, but in who he had become. And as he turned to lock up the center for the night, he did so with a heart full of gratitude, ready for whatever the future might bring, knowing he'd never walk his path alone again. In the following months, Tom's involvement with the community continued to deepen, and he found himself forming bonds that felt more like family than mere friendships. The mentorship program blossomed, drawing in more teens and young adults, many of whom came to see Tom not only as a mentor, but as a role model who'd shown them the power of transformation. One evening, the community center hosted a special celebration in honor of the mentorship program's success. The event was vibrant and filled with laughter, music, and heartfelt conversations. Tom moved through the room, talking with parents, chatting with teens, and catching up with volunteers. Elijah and Mia were close by, sharing stories and exchanging laughs with those gathered. The atmosphere was filled with joy, a testament to the positive impact the center had on everyone involved. Midway through the evening, Mia took to the small stage and tapped a microphone, gathering everyone's attention. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice warm and inviting. "This celebration is about more than just the success of our mentorship program. It's about the power of community, the courage to change, and the incredible difference one person can make." She looked over at Tom, smiling with pride. "And tonight, we'd like to take a moment to honor someone who's shown us all that it's never too late to grow, to give, and to truly become a part of something meaningful." Tom felt a lump form in his throat as Mia gestured for him to come forward. Reluctantly, he approached the stage, feeling the familiar warmth of the community's gaze upon him. He was humbled, his heart pounding as he took the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft and filled with emotion. "I don't know if I deserve this, but I can tell you one thing. Each of you here has changed my life in ways I can never fully express. I spent so many years closed off, thinking I knew what life was about. But you've all shown me the true meaning of community, of belonging, and of friendship." He looked out at the crowd, seeing familiar faces, each one representing a unique story and a piece of the journey he'd taken. "I never thought I'd be standing here, feeling like I'm a part of something this special, but thanks to each of you, I finally know what it means to be home." The room filled with applause, and as Tom stepped down, he was greeted by handshakes, hugs, and warm words from those around him. Elijah and Mia were there, their eyes filled with pride and joy, and Marcus, who had once been so unsure of himself, gave Tom a grin that spoke volumes about the admiration and respect he'd earned. That night, as the celebration continued and laughter filled the room, Tom knew he'd found his purpose, a life filled with meaning, connection, and love. And as he looked around at the people who had become his family, he understood that his journey was far from over. There would always be new ways to give, new lives to touch, and new lessons to learn. But for now, he was content, grateful, and ready for whatever lay ahead, knowing he would always have this community by his side, and they would have him by theirs. As the evening wound down, Tom found a quiet moment to himself, standing by a window and gazing out at the neighborhood that had transformed him. The lights of the community center reflected softly in the glass, casting a warm glow over the street. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the choices he'd made, and the unexpected friendships that had shaped his life in ways he could never have anticipated. A gentle voice broke through his thoughts. "Mind if I join you?" It was Elijah, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Tom with a smile and settled beside him, both men standing in companionable silence for a moment as they looked out over the street. "You know," Elijah said quietly, "when Mia and I first met you, we weren't sure what to expect. But seeing the changes you've made, the impact you've had on this community, it's been remarkable, Tom." Tom took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle over him. "Honestly, I wasn't sure I had it in me," he admitted, his voice soft. "For so long, I lived in my own world, blind to everything outside of it. But you, Mia, Marcus, this entire community showed me something I never knew I was missing." Elijah nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's never too late to learn, Tom. The way you've opened your heart to everyone here, it's a gift, not just to them but to yourself." He paused, looking over at Tom with a knowing smile. "You've built something lasting here, something that will outlive all of us." Tom's heart swelled with a quiet pride, the realization settling in that he had indeed become part of something far greater than himself. They stood together, watching as the last few people left the center, their laughter and voices fading into the night. Tom felt a deep contentment, a sense of peace he hadn't known before this journey began. Finally, he turned to Elijah, a soft smile on his face. "Thank you, Elijah, for everything. I may have started out trying to make amends, but what I found here, it's changed my life. I'm grateful for it every day." Elijah nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Tom's shoulder. "And we're grateful to have you, Tom. This community wouldn't be the same without you." As they stood there, Tom knew that he had truly found his place. He'd become part of a family, one built on understanding, growth, and compassion. And with that understanding came a quiet certainty. He was exactly where he was meant to be, ready to face the future with a heart that was full and a spirit that had finally found its home. The days following that memorable evening flowed peacefully, filled with the everyday joys of being fully immersed in the community. Tom continued his work at the center, his connections growing deeper with each passing week. He spent time helping the teens with their studies, sharing life lessons, and even learning new things from them in return. The once distant, reserved landlord had transformed into someone the community trusted and depended on, and the sense of purpose he felt was unlike anything he'd experienced before. One morning, as Tom was organizing books in the makeshift library corner at the center, Marcus walked in, carrying a stack of papers. He wore a serious expression, one that immediately caught Tom's attention. "Hey, Tom," Marcus greeted him, carefully placing the papers on the table. "There's something I've been working on, and I wanted you to see it." Tom smiled, intrigued. "Of course, Marcus. What's this?" Marcus took a deep breath. "It's a proposal. I've been thinking. What if we expand the mentorship program? We could bring in more volunteers, set up workshops, and even offer internships for some of the older teens. I want this to be something that lasts, something that keeps growing, even after I graduate." Tom felt a surge of pride as he looked over the neatly organized plans Marcus had laid out. The young man's vision was ambitious, filled with ideas that could truly make a lasting difference in the lives of so many. Tom could see the passion in Marcus's eyes, a drive that reminded him of his own newfound commitment to helping others. "This is incredible, Marcus," Tom said, admiration clear in his voice. "You've put so much thought into this, and I think it's exactly what this community needs. Let's do it. I'll help however I can." Marcus's face lit up with excitement. "Really, you mean it?" "Absolutely," Tom replied, his tone steady and filled with encouragement. "This is your vision, Marcus, and I'll support you every step of the way. Let's talk to Elijah and Mia, and we'll figure out how to bring this to life." They spent the next few hours brainstorming, refining ideas, and planning the next steps. Tom could see how far Marcus had come, from a shy, uncertain young man into a confident leader with a vision for the future. And Tom, too, had grown in ways he hadn't anticipated, finding joy and fulfillment in being part of something meaningful. As they wrapped up their planning session, Marcus looked at Tom with a grateful smile. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, Tom. You showed me that change is possible, and you've inspired me to make a difference." Tom placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, his voice filled with warmth. "Marcus, you've inspired me just as much. Watching you step into this role, taking charge, and dreaming big, it's a reminder that we all have something valuable to give, and I'm honored to be part of your journey." In that moment, Tom realized that the mentorship program was no longer just a project. It had become a legacy, something that would continue to grow and thrive, fueled by the passion and dedication of those who believed in its purpose. And he knew that, long after he was gone, this community would carry on, its heart and spirit woven into the lives of everyone it touched. For Tom, there was no greater fulfillment, no truer success than this. He'd found his place, his purpose, and his family, and he would continue to give to them, knowing that his life had finally found its meaning. A few months later, the mentorship program had expanded in ways Tom and Marcus had only dreamed of. The community center buzzed with new volunteers, additional workshops, and even visiting speakers who offered their time and expertise to inspire the teens. Marcus had stepped up as a natural leader, overseeing projects, coordinating events, and helping his peers find their strengths. Watching the young man's confidence and influence grow was a source of immense pride for Tom, who had come to see Marcus as a reflection of the community's resilience and hope. One evening, as Tom was finishing up some paperwork at the center, Elijah joined him, taking a seat beside him at the worn wooden table they'd shared so many moments over. He looked at Tom with a thoughtful expression, one that hinted at something important on his mind. "You've done something truly special here, Tom," Elijah began, his voice steady and warm. "The impact you've made, not just with the mentorship program, but with the way you've brought people together, well, it's changed the entire community. You've become a cornerstone, someone people look up to." Tom felt a flush of humility, still not fully accustomed to receiving such praise. "I've just tried to make up for my past mistakes, Elijah. It's this community that welcomed me in, that gave me a second chance. I'm just grateful to be part of it." Elijah smiled knowingly, nodding. "It's more than that, Tom. You've shown people that transformation is real, that redemption is possible, and now there's something I think you should consider." Tom raised an eyebrow, curiosity piqued. "What's that?" "We've been talking with the community board," Elijah explained, "and there's an opportunity coming up. The board wants to open a new leadership role for the center, someone who will help oversee all the community programs, expand the outreach, and really keep this place thriving. They'd like you to take it on, Tom." The words hung in the air, and Tom felt a swell of surprise mixed with a profound sense of purpose. He'd never expected to be offered such a role, to be seen as someone who could lead the very community he'd once distanced himself from. It was an honor he hadn't thought himself worthy of, yet the look in Elijah's eyes told him that this was no token gesture. It was a recognition of who he'd become. Tom took a deep breath, feeling the weight and the gift of the offer. I'm honored, Elijah. Truly. I can't think of a greater privilege than to serve this community in that way." Elijah's face lit up with approval. "Then it's settled. We'll make the arrangements, and soon enough, you'll officially be leading this center into its next chapter." As they shook hands, Tom felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude and fulfillment. This was more than just a role. It was the culmination of a journey, a commitment to the people he'd come to love and respect. And he knew, deep in his heart, that he would give everything he had to ensure the center thrived, that it would remain a beacon of hope, unity, and growth for everyone who walked through its doors. In that quiet moment, Tom realized that he'd not only found his purpose, but had been given a chance to carry it forward, to lead others along the very path that had changed him. It was a new beginning, one he welcomed with open arms, knowing that he would continue to give back to the community that had given him everything. The announcement of Tom's new role as the director of the community center was met with an outpouring of support and excitement. The entire community rallied behind him, and messages of congratulations poured in from people of all ages, backgrounds, and walks of life. Each one reminded Tom of the connections he'd built and the lives he'd touched since opening himself up to this new way of living. It was a humbling experience, and he was more determined than ever to fulfill his responsibilities with care and dedication. In his first week, Tom threw himself into his new role with energy and focus, meeting with community members, volunteers, and local organizations. He began implementing Marcus's ideas for internships and expanded workshops, creating partnerships with nearby businesses to offer job training and hands-on experiences for teens. Tom wanted the center to be more than a safe space. He wanted it to be a launchpad for dreams, a place where anyone could find guidance, resources, and a network of support. One afternoon, as he walked through the bustling halls of the center, Tom noticed a familiar face near the entrance, his old neighbor Susan, who had been the first to challenge his worldview back when he had refused to rent to the Johnsons. She smiled warmly as he approached, her eyes reflecting a sense of pride and approval. "Tom, it's amazing what you've done here," she said, looking around the lively center. "You've turned this place into something extraordinary." Tom chuckled, a bit self-conscious. "It's the people here who made it possible. I just found my place among them." Susan nodded, her smile deepening. "Well, they wouldn't have had this place without you. And I know it hasn't always been easy. It takes courage to change the way you did, to become someone the community can look up to." He felt a surge of gratitude, remembering that it was Susan who'd first planted the seeds of doubt in him, the gentle push that had set him on this path. "Thank you, Susan. You were the first to help me see the bigger picture, and I'm forever grateful for that." She placed a hand on his arm, giving it a gentle squeeze. "And I'm grateful to have watched your journey, Tom. It's a reminder of the good that can come from forgiveness, from giving others a chance to grow." As Susan left, Tom felt a renewed sense of purpose, her words reinforcing everything he'd come to believe about transformation and community. He continued his rounds through the center, stopping to chat with familiar faces, helping teens with their projects, and listening to the stories of each person who crossed his path. This place had become a reflection of his journey, a symbol of growth, resilience, and the beauty of second chances. That evening, as he locked up the center, Tom stood in the quiet entryway, taking in the stillness. The center was empty now, but the energy of the day lingered, filling the space with a warmth that wrapped around him. He closed his eyes, breathing it all in, feeling the peace and fulfillment that had come from finding not only a purpose, but a family. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself and to the community to continue building, growing, and giving back. This wasn't just his work, it was his life's calling. And as he stepped out into the night, Tom Dawson knew that he had finally come home. As Tom settled into his role, he began to envision even greater possibilities for the community center. He started reaching out to organizations and individuals beyond the neighborhood, building networks that could bring more resources, opportunities, and exposure to the people he served. His vision was clear: to make the center a place where anyone, regardless of their background or circumstances, could find a path forward. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for a new scholarship fund he hoped to launch, Marcus burst into Tom's office, grinning from ear to ear. Behind him were several of the teenagers from the mentorship program, each holding a small bouquet of flowers and a handmade card. Tom looked up, surprised and a bit bewildered. "What's this all about?" he asked, a smile spreading across his face as he looked at the teens, each of whom wore expressions of excitement and pride. Marcus stepped forward, clearing his throat with a playful air of importance. "Tom, we wanted to show you how much you mean to us," he said, holding out a card decorated with doodles and heartfelt messages. You've changed all of our lives, and we thought it was time to let you know just how much you've inspired us." Tom took the card, his heart swelling as he read the words written by each young person, expressing gratitude, admiration, and memories they'd shared with him. He looked up, moved beyond words, his voice catching in his throat. "Thank you," he managed, his eyes misty. "You don't know how much this means to me." One of the younger girls, shy but clearly excited, stepped forward and handed him a bouquet. "We want you to know that you're not just a mentor to us, Tom. You're family," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Those words hit Tom deeply. Family. He'd spent years in isolation, prioritizing work over relationships, possessions over people. And now, here he was, surrounded by young people who saw him as more than just a leader or a guide. They saw him as someone they could rely on, someone who had been there in ways that went far beyond the walls of the center. Unable to hold back, Tom pulled Marcus and the others into a group hug, laughing as they piled in, some of them still holding their flowers and cards. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy, a reminder of all the connections he'd made and the love he'd found in a place he once saw as simply a business venture. As the teens pulled back, Marcus looked at Tom with a serious, almost reverent expression. "You've taught us that no matter where we start, we can become the person we're meant to be," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "And you showed us that change isn't just possible, it's powerful." Tom smiled, his heart full. "You've all taught me just as much, if not more," he replied. "I wouldn't be here without you. Each of you has shown me what courage, resilience, and kindness really mean. And for that, I'm forever grateful." The teens lingered for a while, sharing stories and laughing together, until the sun began to set outside the windows. As Tom watched them leave, he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, knowing that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The community center had become more than a building, more than a program. It was a place where lives intersected, where dreams were nurtured, and where family was redefined in the most beautiful way. And as he closed up that evening, he realized that his journey had not only been one of redemption, but of love, a love that had brought him full circle, from a man seeking forgiveness to a man surrounded by family. A few weeks after that heartfelt moment with the teens, Tom received an unexpected phone call from a reporter at the local newspaper. Word of the transformations taking place at the community center and of Tom's own journey had spread, and the reporter wanted to feature the center in a story. Initially hesitant, Tom wasn't one for attention or praise. But after some thought, he realized that sharing their story could inspire others and perhaps bring in more support for the programs they were building. On the day of the interview, the reporter arrived at the center with a photographer, ready to capture the essence of what made this place so special. Tom took them on a tour, introducing them to the staff, volunteers, and some of the teens, each of whom shared how the center had impacted their lives. Marcus proudly walked them through the mentorship program, explaining the skills and confidence he and his peers had gained. Mia and Elijah spoke about the vision they'd built together with Tom, a vision that continued to evolve with each person who joined their community. As the interview progressed, the reporter asked Tom about his journey, about what had led him to make such a profound change. Tom paused, searching for the right words as he reflected on how far he'd come. "It started with a mistake," he began honestly. "I made a choice based on prejudice, on a narrow view of the world I thought I understood. But I was given a chance to learn, to open my eyes to the lives and stories around me. And once I saw that, I knew I couldn't go back to the person I was before." He gestured around the center, filled with people talking, laughing, and supporting one another. "This place, it's a symbol of that change. It's proof that we can all become better versions of ourselves. We're not defined by our pasts, but by how we choose to move forward." The reporter listened intently, taking notes, her expression one of admiration. "What do you hope people take away from your story, Tom?" she asked, pen poised, ready to capture his words. Tom thought carefully, looking out at the teens in the room, at the volunteers, and at his friends. "I hope people see that it's never too late to grow, to give, and to find family in unexpected places," he said softly. "I hope they see that change isn't about perfection. It's about commitment, about taking one step at a time toward becoming someone you're proud of." When the article was published a week later, it captured the heart of their journey beautifully. The center received an influx of donations, offers to volunteer, and messages from people who had been moved by Tom's story. The community rallied around them, eager to support the programs that had become a lifeline for so many. Tom found himself deeply moved by the responses, by the letters and notes from strangers who shared their own stories of transformation and forgiveness. The community center was thriving, not just as a physical space, but as a beacon of hope and unity, proof that change was possible, no matter where one started. And as Tom looked around at the bustling center, filled with people who had come together to build something meaningful, he felt a profound peace settle within him. He'd come full circle, from a man burdened by regrets to someone who had found redemption through love, compassion, and connection. His journey was far from over, but he knew that with every step forward, he was exactly where he was meant to be, surrounded by family, grounded in purpose, and finally, truly home. As the community center continued to flourish, Tom found himself more connected than ever to the people who made it so vibrant and alive. One afternoon, as he was preparing for a workshop, he received a surprise visit from Elijah and Mia. They had that unmistakable look of excitement that usually meant they had something important to share. Tom smiled, inviting them to sit with him in his small office, curious about the news. Elijah cleared his throat, exchanging a quick look with Mia before he began. "Tom, we've been talking with the board and some community leaders, and we have a proposal we want to run by you." Tom nodded, intrigued. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Mia leaned forward, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "The center has become so much more than we ever imagined. It's a place of growth, healing, and unity, and it's reaching people all across town. We want to open a second location in a neighborhood that could really use a place like this, a place where people can come together, find support, and feel like they belong." Tom's eyes widened as he took in their proposal. The thought of expanding the center's reach, of bringing their vision to a new community, filled him with a surge of excitement and purpose. He thought of the lives they'd changed, of the friendships he'd built, and of the legacy they'd created together. The idea of reaching even more people, of offering a lifeline to those who might feel lost or disconnected, was exactly in line with everything he'd come to value. "That sounds incredible," he said, his voice full of conviction. "What can I do to help?" Elijah smiled, clearly pleased with Tom's enthusiasm. "We were hoping you'd take the lead, Tom. You've shown us all what's possible, and we believe you're the right person to bring this vision to life. Your story, your journey, it's what this center stands for, and with you guiding this new location, it would carry the same spirit and heart." Tom felt a wave of humility and gratitude wash over him. Leading this second center felt like both an honor and a natural continuation of his journey. He looked at Mia and Elijah, realizing that they were entrusting him with something sacred, a chance to bring hope and belonging to another community, just as he'd found here. "I'd be honored," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This place changed my life, and I can't think of anything more meaningful than sharing that gift with others. Let's do it." Over the next few months, Tom poured himself into the project, scouting locations, meeting with local leaders, and building connections within the new community. He worked tirelessly, inspired by the people who had once lifted him up and given him a second chance. He was determined to bring that same sense of possibility and support to a new neighborhood, to create a space where everyone would feel welcome, valued, and seen. When the second center finally opened, it was a celebration of everything they had achieved together. Friends from the original center, teens from the mentorship program, and new faces from the neighborhood gathered to mark the beginning of this new chapter. Tom looked around, seeing familiar smiles and hopeful expressions, and felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. As he cut the ribbon, surrounded by his community, he knew that this was just the beginning of a journey that would continue to grow and evolve, reaching people far beyond anything he could have imagined. And with every handshake, every hug, and every word of encouragement, he felt the steady heartbeat of a family that had come together to create something truly extraordinary. Tom had found his purpose, his home, and his legacy, and he knew that as long as there were lives to touch, he would continue to walk this path, giving back to the community that had given him everything. As the weeks passed, the new community center began to blossom with life, much like the first one. Tom found himself bouncing between both locations, welcomed warmly by familiar faces and new ones alike. He'd become a figure of inspiration, not just in his immediate community, but across town, as more people learned about the centers and the support they offered. One day, while organizing a job skills workshop at the new center, Tom noticed a young woman lingering near the entrance, glancing around with an expression that seemed a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. He approached her with a welcoming smile, sensing that she might need a gentle nudge to step inside. "Hello there," he said warmly. "I'm Tom. Is this your first time here?" She looked at him with a shy smile, nodding. "Yeah, I've heard a lot about this place. My friend told me I should check it out. Said it helped her get her life back on track." Tom's heart swelled with pride, knowing that the centers were becoming a source of hope and stability for so many. "Well, your friend was right. We're here to help with whatever you need, whether it's job skills, mentorship, or just a place to feel welcome." She seemed to relax a bit, her shoulders easing as she looked around the room, seeing others engaged in conversations, laughing, and sharing stories. "I just moved here recently, and it's been hard. I haven't really found my footing yet, you know." Tom nodded, understanding that feeling all too well. "I know exactly what you mean. Starting over can be overwhelming, but you're not alone here. Everyone in this place is on a journey, one way or another. We're all here to support each other." The young woman's face softened, her smile growing more genuine. "Thank you, Tom. I think I'd like to give this place a try." Over the next few weeks, she became a regular presence at the center, joining workshops, making friends, and slowly building the confidence she'd once lost. Tom watched her transformation with quiet pride, knowing that the center had given her, as it had given him and so many others, a fresh start and a sense of belonging. One evening, after a particularly lively session at the center, Tom stood by the door, bidding goodbye to the last few attendees. The young woman approached him, a shy but grateful look in her eyes. "I just wanted to thank you, Tom," she said. "This place, it's changed everything for me. I didn't think I'd ever feel like I belonged somewhere, but here, I do." Tom felt a deep warmth fill him as he looked at her, recognizing the spark of resilience that had blossomed in her. "You've done all the hard work," he replied softly. "We just provided the space, and now you're part of this family, just like the rest of us." She hugged him, and he hugged her back, feeling the strength of the community he'd helped to build, a community that kept growing, one person at a time, spreading hope and connection wherever it went. As he locked up the center for the night, Tom looked back at the building, its quiet presence a testament to everything they had achieved. He walked home under the glow of streetlights, his heart full, knowing that his purpose continued to ripple outward, touching lives he hadn't even met yet. And he understood, with a clarity he'd never known before, that his legacy wasn't just about these centers. It was about the people who walked through their doors, found healing, and passed that same kindness and hope on to others. Tom had not only found his family and his purpose, he'd created something that would endure, a legacy of compassion and resilience that would thrive long after he was gone. As time went on, the centers became pillars of the community, places of support, learning, and transformation for anyone who walked through their doors. Tom had settled into his role as leader and mentor, but he never stopped seeing himself as a student too, learning each day from the people he served. Each new face, each story, brought him fresh insight and a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, during a quiet moment at the original center, Tom received a call from a young man he hadn't spoken to in years. It was a former tenant, one of the people who had written to him about the hurt he'd caused in his past. The young man's voice was hesitant, but there was a warmth in his tone that immediately put Tom at ease. "Mr. Dawson." "Tom," the young man corrected himself. "I wanted to reach out because I read about you and the centers in the newspaper. I saw what you've done for the community, and I just wanted to say thank you." Tom was momentarily at a loss for words, a flood of emotions rising within him. "Thank you for reaching out," he replied, his voice soft with gratitude. "Your letter, all those years ago, it opened my eyes. It was one of the first things that set me on this path. I owe so much of this to people like you, who were honest enough to help me see my mistakes." The young man's voice grew more confident as he spoke. "It's good to hear that. I never thought that letter would matter, but seeing what you've built, I realize now that change is possible. I've gone through my own changes too. I've been volunteering at a youth center where I live, trying to make a difference in my own way." Tom smiled, feeling a deep sense of connection and understanding. They were both on journeys of transformation, reaching out to others to bring about positive change. "I'm proud of you," he said, his words filled with genuine admiration. "It takes courage to face the past and create something new from it. You're making a real impact, and that's the greatest legacy any of us can leave." After they hung up, Tom sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on how far they had both come. That one conversation reminded him of the power of redemption and the ripple effect that one person's journey could have on others. He thought about all the lives touched by the centers, each one carrying forward the same kindness, understanding, and compassion. As he looked around the center, bustling with activity and laughter, he realized that his life had become a mosaic of connections, each piece a testament to growth and resilience. Tom knew that his work was far from over. There would always be more people to help, more lives to touch, more stories to share, and he would be there, ready to give, ready to listen, and ready to keep learning from each person who crossed his path. In that quiet moment, he felt a sense of peace, unlike any he had ever known. His journey, his purpose, had come full circle, and the legacy he had built was now woven into the very fabric of the community. He understood that his life would live on, not just in the walls of the centers, but in the hearts of the people who carried his lessons and love forward. And as long as they continued to share that kindness, his story would never truly end.